Hey guys, Giles here. You may not know this, but I have a personal channel that I'm using to become a famous YouTuber. I know, try not to think about it too much. If you like hearing me talk, you can go there and see me post videos about my daily life or me doing just random nonsense. You can search Giles with a J on YouTube or any social media platform. There should be a link above me right now, a link in the description and at the end of this video. So if you want to see more of me, check it out. Thanks. There are few things more terrifying to imagine than your home being invaded in the middle of the night. After all, to be put at risk like that in what is supposed to be the safest and most private of all spaces, well, it would create an unimaginable level of fear. But when that very thing happened to Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn in March of 2015, it would only be the beginning of their nightmare as, after she was kidnapped and Aaron went to the police, the whole situation started unraveling in a way no one else could have predicted, with the police eventually coming to believe that Denise had faked her own kidnapping. But she hadn't. This is Monsters. When Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn first met in 2014, it should have been obvious to anyone who knew them that they'd hit it off. After all, they had a lot in common with one another. They both had the same job as physical therapists, so it should come as a little surprise that in the words of Denise, they were drawn together very quickly. It wasn't as simple as just starting a relationship right away though, at least as far as Aaron was concerned, because despite his attraction to Denise, he was concerned about getting involved with anyone again as he'd just broken off a relationship with a fiancée he'd found out was cheating on him, and because of that, he wasn't sure if he could trust anyone again quite yet. But in the end, he chose to pursue the new romance as he liked Denise that much. Though as time went on, his prior issues would put a strain on the life they were building together. At some point, Aaron's ex-fiancée had gotten back in touch with him via text and asked if they could get back together. And in March of 2015, when Denise found out about both those texts and the fact that her boyfriend had apparently been considering returning to his old flame, she was devastated to say the least. As she would later put it, quote, "I finally just put my foot down and said, look, I don't deserve this. And it was a couple of weeks of kind of going back and forth." At that point, with their relationship hanging in the balance, the pair had to decide what they were going to do next. Would they split and leave things on a sour note, or would they try to work it out and remain together? It was a big decision, and that's why they met at Aaron's home on Mare Island, Vallejo, California on March 22nd, where they planned to hash things out once and for all. Again, in the words of Denise, quote, "I brought pizza and we sat on the couch most of the night and talked. We talked about how it would be difficult. We had to rebuild trust. But as long as he was willing to really give this a full shot, then we could try again." What neither of them realized at the time, though, was that while that night would be a defining one for their relationship, it wouldn't be for the reasons they had anticipated. No, rather than being the evening they put all of their issues to bed and agreed to devote themselves to one another fully, it was instead the beginning of a horror story that almost broke them entirely. It all started at around 3 a.m. the following morning, about 3 hours after the couple had gone to bed, hopeful that things were now going to be better for them. That was when they were woken up by the sound of a voice coming from inside their bedroom. At first, Denise assumed she was dreaming when she heard the voice say, quote, "Wake up, this is a robbery. We're not here to hurt you." But very quickly she realized that was not the case and that, in reality, their house had been broken into by at least one intruder. Obviously, at that point, panic began to set in, and it was also setting in for Aaron now too, as he had woken up to the sight of shadows of figures crossing the hall in front of him. They didn't know what to do other than to obey what the voice told them when it added, quote, "Lie face down." So that's exactly what they did, hearts racing, as from there one of the mystery figures proceeded to bind their hands behind their backs. Once they'd done that, the man instructed Denise to get out of bed and walk into the nearby closet, something she did without question as she had no idea what the intruders would do to her and Aaron if she refused. As far as she could tell, they might have had guns with them, so she didn't want to risk being shot. She simply complied with her head down so as to not see their faces, and when she was inside the closet, she allowed them to tie her up and place swimming goggles covered in duct tape over her eyes as well. But that wasn't all the intruders would do, as they also placed headphones over both her and Aaron's ears. The headphones allowed Aaron to hear a series of pre-recorded audio messages explaining what was going on and what was expected of him. What did the audio messages say? Well, they informed Aaron that his girlfriend was about to be kidnapped and would be held for ransom, a ransom they expected to be paid within the next 48 hours. In the meantime, they were both going to be injected with a sedative that would put them to sleep while they moved Denise to a secure location. But that wasn't the most chilling part of the whole event as far as Aaron was concerned. No, the most chilling part was that these recordings mentioned him by name, making him realize that whoever was doing this, it wasn't any old random kidnapping. And that realization was only further solidified when at one point one of the intruders pulled his headphones off and began asking a series of strange questions. Of course, the reason he was asking those questions was because by then it had become apparent to both him and his accomplice that Denise was not the woman they were looking for. Rather, they were looking for Aaron's ex-fiancée instead. As Aaron would later recall, at that point, the mystery man said to him, quote, "We have a problem. Do Denise and your ex-fiancée look alike?" And when the bound and blindfolded man replied that they did, his captor let out what was described as a guttural sigh. It turned out that it was the same house Aaron had been living in with his ex before they had broken up, and it now appeared that whoever had broken in believed she was still there. Still, despite their mistake, they'd come too far to abandon the plan at that point. And so that was why they took the couple downstairs and from there hauled Denise outside and loaded her into the trunk of her boyfriend's car, all while he was placed on their sofa and told that a camera on his wall would be watching him should he even think about trying to move. Not wanting to risk making the situation any worse, Aaron had no intention of going against their instructions. He did have one request before they left him, and that was for them to at least give him a blanket as he was cold. And as it happened, that would lead to one of the most peculiar details of the whole case being revealed, as it was then the voice told him, quote, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how cold it was because we're all wearing wetsuits." Why were they wearing wetsuits? That was unclear, and it would only hurt Aaron's case when he eventually relayed what had happened to the police, as they found it a little too hard to believe. But that was still a few hours away yet, and before then, the intruder told the terrified young man that they'd be in contact with him soon via text and email. In the meantime, he should call in sick to work and prepare to head over to the bank to withdraw some money. If he refused to do any of those things, they would know as they were watching. And if he even thought about going to the police, they would kill Denise. After telling him that, they left the scene, at which point Aaron was able to push the goggles off his eyes and see clearly once more. Unfortunately for him, though, even if he'd wanted to, he wasn't able to do much else following the attack, as the sedatives that had been given to him while he was tied up on his bed were starting to take effect. And because of that, at around 5 a.m., he passed out. When he woke up again, several hours had passed. He looked at the clock and realized it was 11:30 a.m. So, panicked, he checked his phone and saw there were a number of emails and texts from the kidnappers. In them, the kidnappers demanded he deliver 2 separate payments of $8,500 to them. Obviously, Aaron wasted no time in replying to the messages, but much to his concern, there was no response. And as the minutes and hours went on and still no one had gotten back to him, he began to worry that perhaps they'd gotten tired of waiting for him and done something to hurt Denise. That's why, not knowing who else to turn to, he decided to break the kidnapper's rule and contact the authorities. Namely, his older brother, who was an FBI agent. Of course, when his brother heard about what had happened, he advised Aaron to immediately call 911. So that's what he did, with that leading to officers from the Vallejo Police Department showing up at his door soon thereafter. Once there, they began trying to ascertain what had happened, though their first question should have served as a warning as to what they thought of the situation. As Aaron later recalled, upon entry, they immediately asked him if he was on drugs, to which he replied yes, he had been drugged by the intruders. Then after that, investigators asked him why he'd taken so long to report the incident, to which he responded he'd fallen asleep on account of the drugs he'd been given, something they were clearly reluctant to believe. That was evident in what happened during the formal interrogation that took place back at the station over the hours that followed too, with the interrogation seeing Aaron be further probed about the events of the supposed kidnapping. Detective Matthew Mustard, the man charged with carrying out the interrogation, would go as far as to question the validity of Aaron's claims that he'd fallen asleep as a result of a sedative. As if that wasn't enough, he also had some serious issues believing key elements of the story, such as the fact the intruders were wearing wetsuits. The way he saw it, it looked far more likely that Aaron had killed his girlfriend and dumped her body somewhere, then called the police and tried to make it look like a break-in gone wrong. After all, that would explain the gap in her being taken and him calling the police, and it would also explain the fact that his car was missing. On top of that, it would also explain the small blood stain that had been found on their bed when investigators had searched the house. A blood stain that Aaron tried to argue had nothing to do with the situation and had probably come from a cut one of them had gotten without realizing. But no matter how much he tried to tell Detective Mustard that Denise had been abducted, it was clear he wasn't being believed anymore. As the words of the detective himself about 45 minutes into the interrogation showed, it was all going wrong as he then told Aaron, quote, "I don't think you're being truthful, and I don't think anybody came into your house. The story you're telling here, I ain't buying at all." So what did the police think happened? Well, the way they saw it, it looked far more likely that, given the pair's relationship woes, they'd had some kind of fight on the evening of the 22nd, possibly while they were experimenting with drugs. At some point during the fight, Aaron had either accidentally or purposefully killed Denise, most likely by pushing her down the stairs. Then he panicked and got rid of the body somewhere before anyone could find out about what he'd done. But he hadn't realized that this experienced detective would see right through his lies. Clearly Aaron was no match for the wits of Detective Mustard. The longer he went without admitting to what he had really done, Detective Mustard told him then, the more he was going to look like a monster. But Aaron couldn't admit to murdering his girlfriend because that wasn't what had happened. Still, such a fact didn't stop the police from believing their own conclusion anyway, and it didn't stop them from bringing in his family for questioning, with them probing his mother Mary Ann about whether or not he had a tendency to get angry and lose his cool. Of course, Aaron's parents wouldn't believe he had anything to do with the disappearance of Denise, and they certainly didn't think he'd killed her. No, there was no way that could be true as far as they were concerned. And they assumed that that would be proven once he took a lie detector test. But despite that test coming back inconclusive, not proving or disproving anything, the Vallejo Police Department would take those results as being further evidence of their suspect's guilt, as they were so convinced he had to have been the guilty party, they were blind to any other explanation. Even Aaron started to doubt himself as he began to wonder if he hadn't had some kind of psychotic break which had indeed led to him killing his girlfriend. That said, any doubts he may have had about his own guilt were put to rest when the following day the San Francisco Chronicle received a proof of life message in which a recording apparently featuring the voice of Denise told reporters that she was alive. And if there was any proof needed as to when the message had been recorded, in it she would refer to a plane crash that had happened only the day prior, leading everyone who heard it to now believe she was indeed okay and that Aaron hadn't in fact killed her. Actually, now it was sounding like the story he'd originally told the police, outrageous as it was actually true. And that's why they brought him back to the station in order to get some further information and to have him send a message back to the kidnappers. Once he arrived and was given back the phone that had been confiscated the day prior, however, a member of his legal team noticed it had been on airplane mode the whole time. And when they turned airplane mode off, they realized the kidnappers had tried to call him 3 times over the past day. That caused everyone to fear that Aaron had missed his opportunity to save his girlfriend from her captors, and it was what the authorities feared too. But thankfully those concerns were proven wrong the day after that on March 25th, as that was when Denise resurfaced outside her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, 400 miles or 640 kilometers away from Aaron's house in Vallejo. As she recalled when later asked by the police how she ended up there, she said, quote, "The kidnapper drove me there and pulled me out of the car. I heard him drive off. I slowly counted to 10. I peeled the tape off my eyes and I was by myself in this alley. I grabbed my bags and started walking down that alley and I looked at the corner street name and I saw Utica, which is the street that I grew up on." Unfortunately for Denise, though, once she knocked on her mother's door, no one answered as no one was home at the time. So, still woozy from the effects of the sedative she'd been given, she did all she could think to do, and that was to borrow a cell phone from a stranger on the street and use it to call her father. While her father wouldn't answer the call as he was away from his phone at the time, he would hear the voicemail she left soon thereafter. And when he did and realized she was heading over to his house, he made his way there too, all while he was calling the Huntington Beach Police Department to inform them of what had happened. At that point, officers raced over to his house as well, and when they arrived they found Denise Huskins, confused and clearly in a lot of distress. So they checked that she was okay and then began questioning her as to what had happened, with them taking special care to find out if she'd been sexually assaulted. As Denise would explain it, she hadn't, but she had been kidnapped just as Aaron had claimed. Wanting to get the full story, police took her back to the station and questioned her further. But even though her story appeared to completely line up with what they'd already been told by her boyfriend, the investigators assigned to the case remained hesitant to believe her. After all, why would a kidnapper take someone hostage and then release them again 2 days later without getting paid? No, as far as they saw it, and particularly as far as Detective Mustard saw it, there was something fishy to the entire situation, and he believed he had the whole thing figured out. Like any good detective, Mustard based his belief on a movie, a complete work of fiction. Not long before this case fell in his lap, he'd seen the hit movie Gone Girl based on the Gillian Flynn novel of the same name. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it's a movie that tells the story of a woman who fakes her own kidnapping and death in order to frame her husband for murder. There was absolutely no evidence that suggested that Denise was trying to recreate the events of the movie, but Detective Mustard seemed convinced anyway. At one point, he even started to wonder if it wasn't a ploy the two had cooked up together after seeing the film themselves in order to create a publicity stunt. According to Denise's cousin Nick, who was himself an attorney, Denise was told by Mustard while she was still being questioned, quote, "We'll give immunity to whoever confesses first to making this whole thing up." Though it should be said the detective would later deny making such a statement. Of course. Whether he made it up or not, it's clear that he had such suspicions, and that the local police force as a whole shared those suspicions too, because after Denise was released from custody, they held a press conference in which they stated it looked like the whole thing had been an orchestrated event and not a kidnapping.
And from this point forward, I will not refer to them as a victim or a witness. Mr. Quinn was the first to report that his girlfriend, Ms. Huskins, was forcibly taken from his home in the early morning hours of Sunday by unknown strangers, and at some point they made a ransom demand in the amount of $8,500. We also know that the statement that Mr. Quinn provided was such an incredible story, we initially had a hard time believing it, and upon further investigation, we were not able to substantiate any of the things that he was saying.
As Vallejo Police Department spokesperson Lieutenant Kenny Park would tell the media that afternoon, quote, Mr. Quinn and Miss Huskins have plundered valuable resources away from our community and taken the focus away from the true victims of our community while instilling fear among our community members. So if anything, it is Mr. Quinn and Miss Huskins that owe this community an apology. Of course, to both Aaron and Denise, two people who had just undergone an unimaginable trauma, they couldn't believe what they were hearing. How could the police not see that this had been a real kidnapping, and how could they be so convinced they were lying with no evidence? As Denise would later argue, they were so convinced no crime had occurred, they didn't even issue a sexual assault examination for forensic evidence until long after the fact. Though again, it should be noted that the Vallejo Police Department have denied such a claim. Still, they clearly didn't believe the story they'd been told and now looked at the two young lovers as being guilty themselves when it came to wasting police time and resources with an elaborate hoax. So that was why the pair hired a criminal defense attorney, as they could tell what direction things were going in. And that was to places that weren't going to end well for them. All they had now was each other as far as they were concerned. So they each had to remain strong and to be there for each other. And it was that trust that Denise still had in Aaron to protect her that ultimately led her to being honest about what had really happened to her once they were finally alone. It may not come as a shock to learn that while being held by her captors, she actually had been sexually assaulted. Why didn't she tell the police? Well, to put it simply, she'd been told that if she spoke a word of such acts, then her kidnappers would be able to find her again and they would kill her. They explained to her that they were not a small operation. Rather, they were part of a larger organization involved in kidnapping women for ransom. That had put so much fear into Denise while she was in their captivity, she'd at one point resigned herself to being murdered. But she wasn't murdered. No, after passing out as a result of the drugs given to her and then being driven to a remote location, which would later be identified as a cabin in the Lake Tahoe area, she would wake up on a cold floor, still blindfolded, to the sounds of scrubbing and what sounded like duct tape being handled in a neighboring room. At that point, she understandably began to fear her days were about to come to an end. As she would later put it, quote, "Every horror film I've seen kinda flashed in my mind." And that was when a man came into the room and tried to explain the situation to her, with that situation being that he used to work for the military and was now a kidnapper for hire. As he put it, he had no intention of hurting Denise. She hadn't even been the intended target of their kidnapping. Rather, it had been Aaron's ex they'd been looking for. That said, things were what they were now, and he was going to have to ask her to do some things she probably wasn't going to like, as he had been given orders that came from above his head. After telling Denise to go take a shower, the mystery man had Denise record a proof of life tape that was to be sent to the media in order to prove she wasn't dead. After that was over, she was told she would have to have sex with him on tape so that it could be used for the purposes of blackmail in order to deter her from speaking up about the situation once she was released. Over the 48-hour period that followed, Denise was sexually assaulted on not only one but two separate occasions, with each incident being filmed. During the follow-up assault, she was actually instructed to act like she was enjoying the whole thing, as according to her captors, the first time it didn't look real enough, so it wouldn't be usable as collateral to hold over her head, with that making it an even more traumatic experience for her second time around. Even when she begged them to stop, in fact, with her telling her captors that she'd been abused as a child and didn't want to go through the same thing again, they continued on, only appearing to be interested in getting what they wanted out of the situation. Sure, at least one of her abusers had attempted to try to make her feel better about the situation by claiming that he would be gentle with her, suggesting he had some minor sense of humanity buried deep within him. But that did little to offer any solace to her when she was forced onto a mattress and assaulted. And there was also little solace to be found when that same abuser told her that if she agreed to do as she was told, then they would let her go in a couple of days. Really, the only thing she could do in order to get through the whole thing was to disassociate, an emotional defense mechanism in which a person figuratively leaves their body in order to put some psychological distance between themselves and what is happening. And that's exactly what she did after chugging a bottle of wine prior to the second assault. So for Denise to eventually be released after undergoing such a terrible ordeal and have the police blame her for everything that had happened was basically like spitting in her face. The way she would put it when questioned by the media, quote, "To think I would put all these people through this for 15 minutes of fame makes no sense." But with her being unable to tell the full story to the authorities for fear of reprisal, she felt powerless to set the story straight. And that was why, recognizing things couldn't go on the way it was going, Aaron eventually convinced her to do the next best thing. And that was to confide in their lawyer, where they were confident such a confession would be kept secret. Of course, once their lawyer heard about what had really happened, he advised them to go to the police with the information anyway, even if they had been told they'd be harmed if they did. So that's what they did. Unfortunately, though, it still didn't do much to convince the investigators that they were actually the victims. No, it seemed like Detective Mustard and the rest of the people working the case had far too much of a confirmation bias going on when it came to this case by then. It appears it was such an extreme bias it angered even the kidnappers themselves as, for some reason, upon seeing the coverage on the news and realizing that Denise was very much being painted as a liar, they contacted the San Francisco Chronicle with an anonymous email on March 26th. That email would seemingly prove the victim's story as it showed images of the location where she was being held as well as explicit details only the kidnappers could have been aware of. But even then, once that information was forwarded to the police, they still didn't take it seriously and continued to pursue the narrative that the couple had staged the entire thing in order to create some kind of publicity around themselves. Publicity they could then cash in on by selling their story. As the detectives patted each other on the back for their crack investigation work, all of their theories would come crashing down on June 5th of that same year. It was then another break-in was reported at a house in Dublin, California, about 45 minutes south of Vallejo. That break-in seemed remarkably similar to what Aaron and Denise alleged had happened to them. Yes, men wearing wetsuits and carrying zip ties had invaded a home in that area and attempted to kidnap the woman living there. Unfortunately for them, on this occasion, the woman's husband had been able to fend them off and run them off the property. And to make matters worse, after getting to a safe distance, one of the attempted kidnappers realized he'd left his phone behind in the panic, meaning that once police arrived, they'd be able to use it to track down his identity. His name was Matthew Muller, a former U.S. Marine who, prior to that, had graduated summa cum laude from Pomona College in California, all before then going on to Harvard Law School. Obviously, he didn't fit the typical profile of a kidnapper and sexual predator. But that didn't stop Detective Misty Caruso from the Dublin Police Department from tracking him down to a cabin in the South Lake Tahoe area. When she did, she and the rest of the team were able to not only arrest Matthew, but also find items on the property such as swimming goggles with duct tape over the eyes, one of which had blonde hair stuck to it. Clearly, given the fact none of the victims of the Dublin home invasion had blonde hair, that meant there were likely other cases of kidnapping going on. And it was at that point Detective Caruso remembered the media furore surrounding Denise Huskins and the Gone Girl case, with her recalling them having described being blindfolded with goggles covered in duct tape. As she would later describe it, she always felt there was something wrong about the way Denise had been treated by the authorities in Vallejo, as to her it seemed obvious she was telling the truth. And now that she appeared to have evidence that that was indeed the case, she was excited to share it and hopefully clear the victim's name once and for all. So she contacted the Vallejo Police Department and informed them of the new information. And while at first they seemed hesitant to cooperate, eventually they advised Caruso to call the FBI. Thankfully then, once that was done, things started moving quickly as the feds were able to corroborate further details between the Gone Girl kidnapping story and what had happened in Dublin. On top of that, upon searching Matthew's cabin again, they were able to find Aaron Quinn's laptop as well as his stolen car. A car that was now complete with information in its GPS system that showed the address Denise had been taken to. Needless to say, all of that taken together finally seemed to prove to the police beyond any reasonable doubt that Aaron and Denise had indeed been victims and that they had made a horrible mistake in doubting them. Further investigation of Matthew would prove just how big of a mistake they'd made in not searching for him sooner, as it quickly became apparent that he was responsible for multiple crimes including attempted sexual assault and peeping. He had also been a person of interest in several similar incidents taking place in neighboring cities during the years prior, something that could have easily been uncovered if the authorities had only taken the time to listen to Denise and believe her story. As to why he had done it, however, or why he had almost given himself away when he anonymously contacted the San Francisco Chronicle after the fact, that would remain somewhat of a mystery, as Matthew appeared reluctant to talk about those things in detail once he was in custody. To me, it's likely just based on ego. I think that this was his elaborate way to commit sexual assault and try to get away with it. And him being an ex-Marine and high achiever meant he couldn't handle people not knowing his brilliant plan. It is known that in the run-up to the crime he'd been disbarred from practicing law in the state of California after accepting a $1,250 advance from a client and then failing to secure a green card for their son. And it's also known that after leaving the military, he had been diagnosed with Gulf War illness, something that the National Institute of Health identifies as featuring symptoms such as mood and affective problems and cognitive impairment. On top of that, his lawyer would later claim he suffered from bipolar disorder. But while those diagnoses may give some insight into his mindset, none of that explains how and why Matthew became a kidnapper and sexual predator. And yes, it was now becoming apparent he had been the man who'd sexually assaulted Denise as well, at least according to her, as when she heard his voice on the news, she immediately recognized it as belonging to the man who had attempted to comfort her before violating her in the worst way possible. Was he paid to do so as part of a larger conspiracy, as Denise claimed he told her while she was being held captive in his cabin? That certainly remains an unanswered question at this point. With him refusing to confirm that, and with no one else seemingly coming forward to admit their involvement, it's impossible to say for certain. He outright denied there was any larger conspiracy following his capture, with him at that point saying he'd worked alone and used audio recordings to make it look like there were other people there with him when he was kidnapping Denise. Many people find that difficult to believe and see it as him simply protecting whoever his clients were, perhaps over fear of reprisal should he talk. But if there was indeed a conspiracy, then how was Aaron Quinn's ex-fiancée involved? After all, someone had to have hired Matthew to kidnap her, as she appeared to have been the intended target. Unfortunately, those are questions that, as it stands right now, we don't have definitive answers to. One thing we would get a definitive answer to, however, was what fate would await Matthew, as, not long after he was arrested, he was formally charged with kidnapping for ransom. The reason he wasn't also charged with sexual assault and burglary was because the kidnapping was federal jurisdiction, but the feds don't have jurisdiction for the other crimes. Yes, in a baffling case of legal loopholery, Matthew was going to effectively get away with breaking into the house of Aaron Quinn and Denise Huskins, then forcing himself upon her twice. I find it fascinating that the United States doesn't have some way to properly convict a person who commits both local and federal laws at the same time, but here we are. It doesn't mean he was going to walk away scot-free, because the charges of kidnapping against him were still very strong, so it should come as no surprise that in September of 2016 he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 40 years behind bars. Fortunately, that wasn't the end of the story for Matthew quite yet, as years later he stood trial a second time. That time in a non-federal case where he could be charged with kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and 2 counts of rape by force. This is another example of Matthew Muller's ego taking over, as he initially pleaded not guilty and planned to represent himself at this trial. That meant that he would be able to cross-examine the victims, re-traumatizing the people he had already brutalized. His decision was not met with much support.
People are saying that, yeah, we know the Constitution allows you to confront your accusers, but some people are saying this is odious. It's almost, it makes some people very uncomfortable that you might end up crossing Denise. Your thoughts about their repulsion and how you will ask questions of Denise, in what way, sensitively, carefully, how will you do this?
Sure. Well, I mean, just by way of background, I really did not choose the time for this at all. I was actually, for my own reasons, trying to get a delay for as long as I could. I'd had some problems back in prison. And so, I got here, and my attorney, someone I'd already contracted, was supposed to be handling the case, but he was out of the country. The district attorney's office did not want to wait until he was available to do things. So again, this is someone, I think it said something about how, I'm timing this for their wedding. I have no control over when this is. I really do not. Regarding other things, I really do not want to be the person that cross-examines her. I tried to get the judge to appoint an attorney to do that. I kind of thought that was a no-brainer. The judge didn't want to do that. It's not that he wouldn't appoint counsel, period. It's just that in the short time before the hearing, really, I'm the only one who would know the case well enough to be able to effectively, know the factual background to prepare it in such a short time. But I was just hoping at least to have some other person to just read the questions that I wrote or do something, because I did not want to do that. I guess the judge felt that was not something that the law was amenable to, so there was really nothing I could do about that.
Perhaps realizing the evidence against him was too overwhelming, he changed his mind and pleaded guilty on all counts, with that earning him a further 31 years in prison to be served concurrently with the federal sentence. So basically, no extra time. Of course, even though he had pleaded guilty twice, he wasn't the type of person who was going to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, he blamed his mental health, with him telling the court it had spiraled out of control after he left the military. And to whether he felt any guilt over his actions, he claimed he was sick with shame over all the pain and horror he'd caused. But whether he was truly remorseful or not, it didn't make any difference, as after that he was returned to his prison cell, the same place he remains today and very possibly will remain for the rest of his natural life. While that would be all she wrote for Matthew Mueller, he was only a part of the story, and the real people who should remain the focus are Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn. After all, they're the ones who had to suffer firsthand, and they're the ones who continue carrying that pain to this day. While they had now received some form of justice, they continued to seek further justice in the form of the police being held accountable for the way they handled the case. Of course, why wouldn't they want that though? As Denise put it herself, quote, "If they had actually monitored Aaron's phone, they could have saved me from the second rape." Yes, while Detective Matthew Mustard and his team were lying to Aaron about the results of his polygraph test and making him feel like he was the guilty party, they were neglecting to look at his phone, something that they had in their possession. And had they actually looked at it, they would have noticed it was on airplane mode, and so would have been able to change that in order to allow it to receive messages. Something that would have meant the kidnappers could have then reached them before the second sexual assault was deemed necessary. And that isn't the only big mistake the police made during the course of the investigation. As Melissa Hamilton, professor of law and criminal justice at the University of Surrey, would explain, the fact the investigation team could not see past their own insistence that Denise Huskins had to be living out a real-life version of Gone Girl was nothing short of extreme confirmation bias, a trap any good detective should never allow themselves to fall into. In her own words, quote, "As humans, particularly in terms of investigating events, we want a story that makes sense to us. Instead of thinking about it as a crime, investigators are often thinking that they need to understand the motivations of the people and according to what data they're given. The salience of a movie like Gone Girl is that it made sense of something that at first didn't. That can feed into the confirmation bias that then applies to this situation. Because I made sense of that in the film, now I'm making sense of that in this situation." Obviously then, some questions still had to be asked about the way the case was handled and why the victims were treated the way they were. But at least initially it didn't seem like the Vallejo Police Department had any interest in answering those questions. No, they just wanted to sweep the whole thing under the rug and move on as if nothing had happened. Later in 2015, mere months after the whole incident occurred, Detective Matthew Mustard would even be awarded Officer of the Year in a ceremony held by his department, proving just how little was thought internally of the mistakes both he and others around him had made. That may have been the final straw when it came to Aaron and Denise looking for a formal acknowledgement over the errors that were made at the time, as soon afterwards they filed a defamation lawsuit against the city of Vallejo and its police department. A lawsuit in which they accused Vallejo officers of a vicious and shocking attack that unfairly destroyed their reputations through an outrageous and wholly unfounded campaign of disparagement. That lawsuit would go pretty well for them, although their victory didn't come without a fight. And that was because it took until 2018 for a decision to be reached in the case, with that decision ultimately being that the couple would be awarded $2.5 million in damages should they agree to settle out of court. Because a settlement was reached before a judge could make a formal ruling, it meant the Vallejo Police Department would not have to admit any wrongdoing or face any actual legal repercussions for their actions. And they wouldn't even be forced to offer a public apology to the victims either, despite Aaron and Denise being told that would happen should Matthew Mueller be convicted. Sure, they would get a private letter of apology from then Vallejo Police Chief Andrew Badu, which stated, quote, "It is now clear what had happened to you was not a hoax or orchestrated event and that Vallejo Police Department conclusions were incorrect." Yeah, no shit. But that wasn't enough for the couple. It wasn't enough that the letter also apologized for the unnecessarily harsh and offensive comments of Lieutenant Kenny Parks at the time of the press conference he had held. No, they wanted real action to be taken in terms of not only a public acknowledgement, but also change in the department as a whole. And so that was why they continued to fight for that as the years went on. Of course, given what they'd gone through, that was mentally exhausting as it meant constantly having to relive the trauma of what took place back in March of 2015. And it wasn't just the kidnapping itself which they were reliving either. No, it was the aftermath too. An aftermath that saw them be harassed and torn apart on social media after the public was led to believe they'd lied about their story. As Denise herself said in a 2021 interview with People magazine, quote, "When I was kidnapped, I didn't know if I was going to live or see another day. And then to have people attack you on social media, the whole Gone Girl label, a whole persona was placed on me that had nothing to do with who I am." Thankfully, though, all of their fighting would be worth it in the end, as later that same year a formal public apology would finally be issued by then Vallejo Police Chief Shawnee Williams, with their statement reading, quote, "The Huskins-Quinn case was not publicly handled with the same type of sensitivity a case of this nature should have been handled with, and for that, the city extends an apology to Miss Huskins and Mr. Quinn. What happened was horrific and evil. I am committed to making sure survivors are given compassionate service with dignity and respect. Although I was not chief in 2015 when this incident occurred, I would like to extend my deepest apology to Miss Huskin and Mr. Quinn for how they were treated during this ordeal." And so like that, Denise and Aaron got what they were looking for and were able to start moving on with their lives in full. In 2018, they'd gotten married at a ceremony held near the water in Monterey, California, with their first dance being to a rendition of Dierks Bentley's Riser, a song about overcoming a tragedy and rising like a phoenix from the ashes. But that wasn't the only big change the now happy couple had gone through since their traumatic incident, as 2 years later in 2020, they initially welcomed their first daughter, Olivia, into the world. Her birth came 5 years to the day after Denise had been released from her captivity. Then, as if that wasn't enough, in November of 2022, after finally receiving their apology from the police, they had a second child named Naomi. And now that they have kids of their own to raise, they understand even more the importance of fighting for justice. As Denise would state in another interview with People magazine in January of 2024, quote, "I want them to know their value and to never let anyone dictate that or determine that for them." Of course, by the time that interview was released, the case had gained a whole new wave of public interest on account of Netflix filming a documentary on the subject entitled American Nightmare. For anyone watching it looking to gain a deeper perspective as to what the investigation team were thinking at the time, they'd be sorely disappointed, as despite the producers' best efforts, no one at the Vallejo Police Department would agree to comment on the matter. And that wasn't the only thing that some found unsatisfying when watching the retelling of events because, as it went on, many who were only now becoming familiar with the case began to realize there were still a lot of unanswered questions as to how many people had actually been involved in the kidnapping and what their exact motive had been. But then, that's something Denise and Aaron still struggle with as well as, even if they have been able to start a new chapter of their life, they can't help but occasionally wonder what the real story behind the whole thing had been. Was Matthew Muller working alone on the night of the home invasion as he claimed, or was it true that there was someone else there with him? The latter is certainly what Denise believes. She continues to argue that, while being moved to the closet that night, she was able to see a second pair of legs as her eyes briefly opened. But even if she hadn't seen that, she insists some of the things that were done to her could not have been carried out by one single person. So, if there are others who were directly involved, are they still out there? And can the same be said for the leaders of the alleged kidnapping ring that hired them to do the job? Then there's Aaron's ex-fiancée. Why was she the original target that night? Had she made a powerful enemy unbeknownst to her former partner, someone who was willing to have her kidnapped? Or was it just a simple case of them thinking Aaron had the money, so if they took the person they still believed to be his partner, then he'd pay up? These are all questions that still don't have answers, and they may never have answers at this point. While it may be unsatisfying for some and deeply troubling for others, Aaron and Denise have tried to not let it get to them for the most part, as to do so would only end up destroying them from the inside out. As she put it herself, quote, "Like many victims or many people who have gone through tragedy, you don't get all the answers, and that can be a sticking point to recovery. So for us, we don't rely on finding those answers, but what we have to do is move forward in the unknown and focus on things that matter the most to us, like our family, our kids, our work. Those are sustainable things, and having the answers of why they targeted us doesn't change what we do as far as moving forward." There's no question that Matthew Muller is a monster. Terrorizing countless people for your own personal gain is what evil people do. But unfortunately for Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn, the Vallejo Police Department, the people who were supposed to be protecting them, didn't treat them any better, proving that you never know where you're going to encounter a monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.